Tonight, let us begin slowly. Take a deep breath, settle into whatever position feels most restful, and allow your thoughts to drift backwards in time. The subject before us is one that has long fascinated, amused, and occasionally scandalized those who study the Middle Ages, the intimate world of medieval love, courtship, and desire. It is a world wrapped in contradiction, at once rigidly controlled by the church and yet endlessly inventive in how ordinary men and women navigated their lives. Before we step into that world, I want to extend a gentle invitation. If you are enjoying these stories, a small gesture helps more than you can imagine. A quick like, or even subscribing to this channel, allows me to continue weaving these long, quiet journeys into the past. I am always curious to know where listeners are tuning in from. If you feel inclined, leave a comment sharing your location and what time it is where you are. I often picture people listening in the stillness of their bedrooms or perhaps with headphones during a quiet walk, and it is remarkable to imagine how far these words may travel. Now, if you haven't already dimmed the lights around you, perhaps leave a fan on for that soft, steady hum in the background. The goal is not excitement but calm immersion, a space where history itself becomes the lullaby that eases you into rest. Together we will wander gently into the 13th and 14th centuries, where the rules of intimacy were both highly prescriptive and yet endlessly bent by those who lived under them. It is best to begin not with myth but with misconception. When modern people picture intimacy in the medieval world, they often imagine romanticized scenes, candlelight flickering across stone walls, silk sheets spread out on wide feather beds, and the soft tones of a lute drifting through the chamber. Such images belong more to novels and television dramas than to lived experience. In reality, privacy was a rare commodity. For most peasants, and indeed for many members of the nobility as well, intimate life unfolded not in hushed seclusion, but in full view of family servants and sometimes even animals. Picture instead a modest one-room dwelling in a medieval village. The walls are wattle and daub, patched with straw and mud, with a thatched roof that leaks in the winter rains. Inside space is precious. Children, parents, and grandparents sleep within arm's reach of one another. The hearth that provides warmth is also the kitchen, and near the door, a small penned space may hold a goat or a few chickens. The scents mingle: the sharp smoke of the fire, the earthy musk of animals, the sour tang of brewing ale, and the warm human smell of bodies living close together. Here, when night falls and the household gathers to rest, privacy is almost non-existent. Curtains, if they exist at all, are made from rough cloth and used more to block drafts than to shield the eyes of onlookers. Yet even in such surroundings, life continued. Couples found their moments of tenderness wherever and however they could. Timing mattered. So did quiet voices. If a child was already asleep or a neighbor's footsteps could be heard on the lane outside, couples learned to be discreet. In this way, the rhythm of ordinary medieval life shaped the rhythm of love. It was not the sweeping romance of troubadour songs, but rather a quiet, practical affection adapted to circumstances. Even among the upper classes, things were rarely as private as we imagine. A noble couple might indeed have a chamber of their own, yet servants often slept nearby, sometimes even at the foot of the bed. A trusted maid, a page, or a scribe might remain present long after the candles were extinguished. In some households, written records of who slept where were kept for legal and religious purposes, an arrangement that seems almost comical to modern eyes. Imagine a scribe carefully noting which lady in waiting shared the chamber with her mistress, or which steward was positioned outside the door to ensure propriety. The medieval bedroom was less a retreat from the world and more a stage upon which society and family obligations still pressed their weight. Traveling offered little relief. Inns were communal by nature, with multiple travelers sharing straw mattresses. It was not unusual for strangers to end up side by side, boots and cloaks thrown in a corner, the room filled with the sound of snores, coughs, and whispered prayers. For those seeking affection, it was a test of patience and timing. One had to be sure the bed was not already occupied, and if it was to accept the awkward company. Even in urban centers where houses were larger and life more crowded, walls were thin and gossip spread swiftly. The notion of secrecy was fragile at best. Within monasteries and convents, privacy was officially non-existent. The rules were clear: no wandering conversations, no late-night whispers, and certainly no romantic entanglements. Yet human nature being what it is, even behind high cloister walls, complications arose. Many monasteries were built with gardens enclosed by unusually tall walls, not only to protect their herbs and vegetables, but also to keep temptation firmly outside, or as some historians note with a wry smile, to keep temptation firmly within. What shaped all of this more than anything else was the authority of the Church. In sermons, in confessional manuals, and in the writings of bishops and theologians, a strict framework was laid out for how and when intimacy might be permitted. According to these teachings, its purpose was singular: the begetting of children. Pleasure bonding or personal comfort were considered distractions at best, sinful at worst. Within marriage, couples were urged to meet one another with modesty and restraint. One widely circulated guide from the 13th century advised that intimacy should be pursued without pleasure, without sin, and without delay. To our ears it sounds almost joyless, yet to them it was framed as virtuous discipline. The church calendar itself became an obstacle course. Entire seasons, Lent, Advent, major feast days were off limits. Certain days of the week were forbidden. Add together all the prohibitions and nearly half the year was considered unsuitable for married life. The intent was clear: to keep minds directed toward heaven even as bodies yearned for earth. Yet reality, as it often does, strayed from prescription. Enforcement was uneven. Priests varied in their zeal. Peasants, absorbed by the demands of harvest, livestock, and survival, often nodded politely to such rules and then carried on quietly as they always had. As you listen, imagine the quiet struggle of balancing affection with expectation. For medieval couples, arranging a moment together required not only a calendar and discretion, but sometimes the blessing of a confessor and a measure of luck. It was not easy, and yet within these limitations, love and connection endured. That is one of the most human truths of the period. Despite rules, prohibitions, and the ever-watchful eyes of neighbors, affection found a way. This is where we begin our journey, not in a candlelit fantasy, but in the smoky, crowded rooms of ordinary people, where intimacy was woven into the rhythms of daily life, subject to the strictures of faith, and yet always colored by the persistence of human longing. Tonight we will walk slowly through that world, discovering the oddities, the rules, the myths, and the surprising resilience of love in the Middle Ages. To step more fully into this medieval world, let us linger a little longer inside the homes where most of life unfolded. Picture a small timber-framed cottage, its walls plastered with mud and straw, its roof sloping and uneven, patched again and again against the rain. When the wind rose, you could hear it whistle through the cracks. When the fire smoked, it filled the entire interior, clinging to hair and clothes. For families who lived within these walls, privacy as we understand it today was almost unimaginable. The single room served every purpose. It was the kitchen, the dining hall, the nursery, and the stable. The hearth glowed in the center, not only for cooking, but for warmth, for light, and for protection from spirits and sickness. Around it gathered children, parents, and sometimes visiting relatives, all seeking shelter in the same space. Animals were part of this world too. Goats tied near the doorway, chickens roosting in the rafters, a pig rooting around in the corner. Their presence was not unusual, it was practical. In the depths of winter, the warmth of animals helped to keep a household alive. Under these circumstances, a married couple who wished for a moment of closeness had to navigate carefully. Curtains were a rare luxury, beds were often nothing more than sacks of straw, and sound carried easily. To avoid the watchful eyes of children or elders, timing was crucial. Waiting until others had fallen asleep, or until the room was filled with the loud chorus of snores, was sometimes the only option. There was little chance of romance as we imagine it. Instead, there was the pragmatism of survival: do what one could, when one could, and with as much quietness as possible. And yet within this practicality there was tenderness. Whispered conversations in the dark, a shared blanket against the cold, the comfort of another heartbeat in the night, these were the everyday gestures of affection. We might look back and call them modest, but for those who lived then, they were genuine moments of connection. Human intimacy, even in its simplest form, was a kind of resistance against the hardships of life, a reminder that warmth could exist in more than just the hearth fire. Among the wealthier classes, conditions were more comfortable but not necessarily more private. A noble family might inhabit a stone manor house with multiple chambers, yet servants were a constant presence. They tended fires, fetched water, carried messages, and guarded doors. In many households, it was expected that attendants would remain nearby even at night, sleeping on pallets in the same room. The presence of others was a safeguard for reputation, but it meant that true solitude was nearly impossible. A lady of status might have her maidens, a lord, his pages, all within arm's reach. To be noble was to be observed. In fact, many noble households kept records of bedroom arrangements. These were not love notes or poems, but practical lists: who slept where, who shared which bed, who was present during the night. Such records were important for legal matters, inheritance, and sometimes church oversight. Imagine the awkwardness of knowing that your private moments were overseen not only by servants but also by clerks and confessors. The very act of being married placed one within a web of obligations that extended into the bedchamber. Travelers faced their own challenges. Inns were not the private guest rooms we think of today, but large shared spaces. A single straw mattress might be occupied by several strangers. Shoes and cloaks piled in corners, the air heavy with the scent of sweat and ale, the room echoing with snores and murmurs. If affection was sought on the road, discretion became even more complicated. You could never be certain who was already asleep nearby, or whether the innkeeper's watchful eye would notice. Some travelers joked that the hardest part of sharing a bed with strangers was not the lack of space, but the uncertainty of who would bring boots or fleas into the straw. The lack of privacy extended beyond the household. Communities were small and gossip was quick. A conversation by the well could be overheard by neighbors, a glance exchanged in the market could be noted and repeated. Entire villages often invested themselves in the lives of young couples, sometimes supervising courtships with an attention that feels startling to us. In such an environment, secrets were difficult to keep. The walls between private life and public judgment were paper thin, and people learned to live with the awareness of constant eyes. Even in places devoted to seclusion, such as monasteries and convents, human nature found ways to complicate matters. The rules forbade personal intimacy, but the absence of privacy could not erase longing. Many cloisters were built with unusually high walls designed to shield not only from the outside world, but also from temptation within. These walls still stand in parts of Europe today, tall and silent reminders of the tension between spiritual ideals and human impulses. It is easy to forget in our world of locks, doors, and private rooms how unusual privacy actually is in human history. For medieval people, to be constantly observed was normal. Children grew up falling asleep beside parents. Servants expected to attend their masters in every routine. Villagers accepted that their lives were an open book, written not on parchment but in whispers carried down narrow lanes. The rhythms of intimacy, therefore, were inseparable from the rhythms of community. To live in the Middle Ages was to share space, to compromise, and to find affection in the midst of company. When we imagine those moments of closeness, it helps to picture not a grand romance but a quiet practicality. A shared glance across a crowded hall, a soft touch when no one was looking, the patience to wait until the right moment arrived. Intimacy was not only a matter of passion but of planning. It required silence, restraint, and sometimes a little luck. In this sense, medieval affection was woven deeply into the fabric of daily life. It was not separate from the struggles of survival, it was one of the few comforts that made those struggles bearable. As you allow yourself to sink deeper into relaxation, think of that small cottage with its smoky rafters and crowded hearth. Imagine the hum of voices quieting as sleep takes hold, the crackle of fire fading to embers, the animals shifting softly in their corners. In that stillness, two people might draw closer, not with luxury or elaborate ritual, but with the simple comfort of knowing that despite the watchful eyes of others, affection could still be found. From the crowded cottages and bustling inns of village life, let us now pass quietly into the cloister, where another form of life unfolded. Within monasteries and convents, the rhythms were different, structured by bells, prayers, and silence. To step inside such a place was to enter a world devoted not to earthly ties, but to the service of heaven. At least that was the intention. Human beings, however, remain human even when wrapped in woolen habits or veils, and the story of medieval monastic life is filled with both discipline and temptation. Imagine yourself walking through the stone gate of a Benedictine abbey in the 12th century. The air grows still, the noise of village chatter fades, and the high walls shut out the world. Inside lies an ordered community, every hour mapped by the rule. Monks rose before dawn for matins, their voices rising in chant beneath vaulted arches. After prayers came work tending fields, copying manuscripts, brewing ale, or caring for the poor at the abbey gate. Silence was a daily discipline, broken only for prayer or necessity. The architecture itself reflected the pursuit of order. The cloister, with its square of covered walkways and central garden, provided both physical enclosure and symbolic seclusion. For nuns, the pattern was similar, though their convents often focused on teaching healing and devotional tasks such as embroidery or maintaining the chapel. Life was regulated by bells from the first dark hours of morning to the final prayers at Compline when the convent fell quiet again. To belong to these communities was to renounce private desire, to devote the body and spirit to God alone. Yet within this framework of devotion, whispers of longing still found their way. That is why many monasteries were built with walls higher than ordinary. They were not only barriers to thieves, but also safeguards against wandering eyes, both inward and outward. The high garden walls enclosing orchards and herb plots served a practical purpose in keeping out animals, but their symbolism was equally strong. Within them lay a carefully tended Eden meant to cultivate purity and contemplation. And yet those very gardens sometimes became places of quiet glances, small gestures, or forbidden whispers. Records survive of abbots and abbesses issuing stern reminders to their communities. Monks were warned against speaking too closely with visitors. Nuns were cautioned against sharing confidences with confessors that strayed into intimacy. There are even accounts of bishops conducting visitations and finding that discipline had slipped, that laughter was heard where silence was prescribed, or that affection had been exchanged where detachment was required. The human heart did not easily submit to regulation. It is important to remember that the choice of monastic life was not always a free one. Some entered out of genuine devotion, longing to dedicate themselves to prayer. Others, however, were placed there by families who could not afford a dowry for marriage, or who sought to secure spiritual favor by donating a son or daughter to the cloister. For these individuals, vows of chastity were less an expression of choice and more a circumstance of birth. Such realities made temptation stronger, for what is forbidden often becomes more vividly imagined. Inside the cloister, the presence of the same gender could create bonds as deep as family. Shared labor, shared devotion, and the quiet hours of prayer cultivated closeness. Some of these attachments were purely spiritual expressions of friendship that comforted those who had left families behind. Others, however, may have leaned into realms of emotion that the rule did not anticipate. Letters from monks to one another sometimes reveal warmth that borders on longing. Chronicles mention abbesses gently reprimanding sisters for affection that went beyond propriety. In all cases, these moments remind us that monasteries were not places inhabited by stone statues, but by breathing, feeling men and women. The church hierarchy responded with strictness, at least in principle. Manuals for confessors warned priests to be cautious when questioning those in religious orders, lest their inquiries stir the very desires they sought to suppress. Some abbots enforced curfews separating younger members from older, restricting movement even within the cloister. In certain regions, the architecture itself reflected these anxieties. Dormitories were designed with open layouts so that no one could easily slip away unnoticed. Windows faced inward, not outward, preventing gazes from wandering to the world beyond the wall. Yet even with all these measures, transgressions occurred. A monk caught in an indiscretion might be sentenced to extra fasts, public penance, or relocation to a stricter house. A nun discovered in similar circumstances might be confined to her cell, deprived of community, until she demonstrated repentance. These punishments sound severe, but they were not always applied with the same vigor. Some abbots turned a blind eye, focusing more on prayer than policing. Some bishops, too, recognized that occasional lapses were inevitable among communities of hundreds. Still, the possibility of scandal loomed large. A single story of impropriety could tarnish the reputation of an entire monastery, threatening its donations, its patronage, and its standing in the diocese. That is why chronicles often record such matters in veiled language. A monk was distracted or a sister was troubled, phrases that hint at human frailty without naming it directly. The language itself was a kind of curtain shielding the world from details too awkward to declare openly. What remains most striking, though, is not the failures but the resilience of these communities. For every whispered story of temptation, there were countless days of discipline carried out faithfully. Imagine the hush of a scriptorium where monks bent over parchment copying the wisdom of past centuries by candlelight. Imagine the convent gardens where sisters tended herbs like sage, thyme, and rue, their hands busy in the soil, their voices lifted softly in hymns. These images remind us that chastity was not merely a rule but a rhythm woven into the texture of daily life. And so when we think of monastic life, it is helpful to see it in shades of grey, not in absolutes. Behind the high walls, devotion and longing coexisted. Silence and whispers shared the same air. The rule forbade, but the heart sometimes resisted. Yet out of this tension came a kind of beauty, communities that persevered, flawed yet faithful, seeking heaven while still rooted in earth. As you rest, you might picture those quiet cloisters under moonlight, their corridors echoing with nothing but the sound of sandals on stone. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls, calling the community to prayer. Within those walls, hundreds of souls breathed the same night air, striving together, stumbling together, and reminding us that even in the strictest silence, the human story of love and longing continued to unfold. To truly understand intimacy in the Middle Ages, we must turn to the calendar. Not the kind of calendar that hangs neatly on a wall, but the sacred cycle of feasts, fasts, saints' days, and holy seasons that structured the year for every Christian community. For us, a calendar may mark birthdays, appointments, and public holidays. For medieval people, it was the rhythm of life itself, and it governed even the most private moments between husband and wife. The Church taught that physical closeness was permitted, but only under strict conditions. It was not to be sought for pleasure, nor as a means of comfort or companionship, but solely for the purpose of producing children. To ensure that couples remembered this rule, theologians and confessors filled their writings with lists of days when intimacy was strictly forbidden. Sundays, for example, were out of the question. The Lord's Day was for worship, not for affection. Fridays associated with Christ's suffering were likewise prohibited. Even Wednesdays raised suspicion, their midweek place tied in some traditions to days of penance. Layered on top of these weekly restrictions were entire seasons of abstinence. Lent, the 40 days before Easter, demanded bodily denial in all forms, from fasting to marital restraint. Advent, the weeks leading up to Christmas, was another period when intimacy was set aside. Major feast days, holy days, and vigils all carried prohibitions of their own. Some manuals went further, advising against intimacy during certain phases of the moon or on the eve of particular saints' days. Taken together, nearly half the year could be considered unsuitable for marital relations. Imagine trying to navigate such a schedule. A husband and wife might look at the days ahead and find that between Lent, Advent, Fridays, Sundays, and feast days, their opportunities were few. One 13th century bishop even scolded a couple for showing what he deemed excessive affection, which, in his view, meant more than once a month. His advice was that they redirect their passion into prayer. The couple, as the story goes, were less than enthusiastic about this suggestion. For peasants whose lives revolved around the rhythms of planting, harvesting, and surviving the winter, such prohibitions often felt distant. Survival left little time for calculating whether a Tuesday fell within a forbidden season. Many would nod politely at sermons and then return to their cottages to live as necessity required. Their concerns were not so much the feast of St. Nun or the phase of the moon, but whether the crop would grow, whether the pig would fatten, and whether they could endure the coming frost. Among the nobility, however, restrictions were harder to ignore. Chaplains, confessors, and spiritual advisors kept careful watch, sometimes even recording confessions with alarming detail. A noble household could not afford scandal, and so compliance was expected, at least outwardly. Letters and chronicles occasionally record couples who attempted to follow the rules only to find themselves discouraged by the sheer number of prohibitions. In one region, nearly 200 days of the year were marked as unsuitable for intimacy. Little wonder that peasants smiled quietly while nobles despaired. Confessors were tasked with probing into the private lives of married couples, and some of their questions survive in old manuals. They were not vague or symbolic, but astonishingly specific. Husbands and wives were asked whether they had followed the calendar of restrictions, whether they had been too passionate, whether they had sought pleasure for its own sake. It is difficult to imagine the silence that must have fallen across the wooden benches of a confessional as parishioners struggled to answer such inquiries. Priests in turn found themselves more familiar with the details of their parishioners' marriages than with their birthdays. Behind these restrictions lay a spiritual ideal. The body was seen as a vessel that could either serve or distract the soul. By limiting physical pleasure, the Church hoped to direct attention heavenward. The denial was thought to discipline desire, turning hearts toward God. Yet the reality was that such rules often added stress rather than serenity. Couples learned to navigate not only their personal rhythms but also an intricate obstacle course of sacred prohibitions. Still, people adapted. Some took the rules seriously, abstaining during Lent and Advent, then resuming with careful moderation. Others followed a pattern of outward compliance and private disregard, smiling at their priest while quietly living as they saw fit. The diversity of practice reflected the diversity of humanity itself. For some, the rules were chains. For others, they were gentle suggestions to be considered and then set aside. It is easy for us centuries later to shake our heads at the strictness of it all. But it is worth pausing to understand why such prohibitions mattered. In an age where life was fragile, where children often died young and plagues swept through villages, the act of bringing new life into the world was deeply serious. To the Church, controlling when and how that act occurred was part of safeguarding souls as well as bodies. Every rule, every forbidden day was framed as a path toward holiness, however burdensome it seemed in practice. As you let these details drift through your thoughts, picture a medieval couple marking their days on a simple wax tablet, or listening as a priest listed yet another prohibition. Perhaps they sighed, perhaps they laughed quietly, perhaps they simply carried on with their lives. In their world, intimacy was not only about love, but about timing, rules, and the hope of avoiding spiritual guilt. And so, when night fell across the village, or the manor, and a husband and wife lay down upon their straw mattress or their feather bed, their thoughts were not only of each other, but also of the calendar of saints and fasts of seasons and prohibitions. To be close required not only affection, but awareness, not only longing, but calculation. In this way, the medieval calendar shaped not just the rhythm of worship, but the rhythm of love itself. It was another reminder that in this world, heaven and earth were never far apart, even in the quietest and most personal of moments. From the strict prohibitions of the church calendar, we move now into the heart of what medieval theologians called the marital duty. To our ears, the phrase already carries a sense of obligation rather than joy, and indeed that is how it was framed. Intimacy within marriage was not treated as a celebration of affection, nor as a way to ease the burdens of daily life. Instead, it was framed as a duty owed between spouses, a responsibility that carried moral weight. One 13th century guidebook for confessors set down instructions in language that feels almost clinical. It advised that a husband and wife approach one another without pleasure, without sin, and without delay. The phrase was meant to remind them that their purpose was not enjoyment but obedience to divine law. Pleasure in this context was treated with suspicion, as though too much affection between husband and wife might lead them away from God. Delay was also frowned upon, for to hesitate was to suggest a reluctance to fulfill one's duty. The act itself was to be done quite literally as quickly as possible. The missionary position, familiar to us today not only by practice but also by name, was the only one widely accepted. It was considered the natural way, symbolizing order, hierarchy, and purpose. Anything else was treated as strange, deviant, or even sinful. Some moral manuals went into great detail about what was allowed and what was not, in ways that suggest their authors thought about the subject more than their audiences might have liked. But behind the detail lay a clear message: intimacy should be practical, moderate, and aimed only at producing children. Confession added another layer of unease. Parish priests were instructed to ask very direct questions of married couples. Had they followed the prescribed method? Had they sought too much pleasure? Had they been overly affectionate? These were not general inquiries into sinfulness, but pointed questions about specific acts posed to ordinary villagers sitting nervously in wooden confessionals. It meant that for many medieval men and women, their spiritual advisors knew more about their marital lives than perhaps even their closest friends. Of course, the enforcement of these rules varied widely. Some priests applied them with great seriousness, pressing their parishioners for detailed answers. Others were more lenient, focusing on broader spiritual matters and quietly allowing couples to live as they chose. In some regions, confessionals became a source of anxiety, while in others they were treated as a formality, a ritual to be endured before returning to ordinary rhythms of life. Among peasants, where survival often depended on cooperation and shared labor, the idea of intimacy without affection was difficult to enforce. A couple who worked side by side in the fields, who shared the strain of harvest and the weariness of winter, often found comfort in each other. Affection was not an indulgence but a way of sustaining strength. They may have nodded to their priest and listened politely, but in the smoky quiet of their cottages they often lived as their hearts guided them. For the nobility, the story was more complicated. With chaplains and confessors keeping closer watch, there was less room to ignore the rules. A lord and lady might be reminded by their advisors of the importance of restraint, their private lives becoming subjects of spiritual scrutiny. Chronicles sometimes record nobles praised for their moderation, as if their marital restraint were a sign of virtue equal to charity or piety. In these circles, intimacy was yet another arena where reputation was at stake. The irony, of course, is that despite all the warnings and rules, human beings found ways to bend them. Affection did not vanish simply because theologians frowned upon it. Couples, especially those in long marriages, learned to balance duty with tenderness. Some even wrote letters expressing warmth and longing, especially when separated by travel or war. These letters remind us that the official teachings of the Church were not always the lived reality. Beneath the weight of obligation, love still stirred. It is worth pausing to imagine what it felt like to live under such expectations. To enter marriage, knowing that your affections would be measured not by your heart but by doctrine. To share a bed not only with your spouse but with the invisible presence of priests and manuals reminding you of what was allowed and what was not. For us, intimacy is often linked with love, joy, and comfort. For them it was entangled with duty, reputation, and sometimes guilt. And yet we should not imagine medieval couples as joyless or devoid of warmth. Affection had its place, even if it had to be carefully expressed. A gentle word at the hearth, a shared meal, a touch of reassurance before sleep, these small gestures carried meaning that no rule could erase. The rhythm of their lives was harsh, and love, when it found a place, was deeply valued. In the end, the Church could prescribe missionary ideals, calendars of prohibition, and guides to confession, but it could not extinguish the quiet reality of human longing. Beneath the rules, couples continued to live, as they always had, navigating duty and affection in the same breath. Their lives remind us that even when intimacy is bound in chains of doctrine, the heart has ways of softening those chains, of turning duty into something gentler, more human. As you let these images settle in your mind, picture a medieval couple lying down at the close of day. Around them the room is dim, perhaps crowded with others, perhaps guarded by servants. In their thoughts are the words of sermons and the weight of expectation, and yet beyond all that there is the simple warmth of being together, the quiet comfort of another presence in the night. When we step from the chamber and its duties into the wider world of romance, we find that medieval courtship was very different from the stories sung by troubadours. Songs and poems spoke of knights sighing beneath windows of ladies, offering tokens of love, of moonlit declarations whispered in gardens. But for most people, love was not the foundation of marriage. Marriage was a contract. It was a bond of land, livestock, and alliances. If affection came later, it was welcomed. If it did not, life carried on. Among peasants, marriage was a practical arrangement negotiated between families. A daughter might bring a dowry of coin, a spinning wheel, a few sheets of linen, or a patch of farmland. A groom might be judged on the size of his ox, the sturdiness of his tools, or whether he had a roof that would not collapse in winter. Reputation mattered too. A woman known for quarrels in the marketplace, or a man with debts at the alehouse could find their prospects diminished. In communities where survival depended on cooperation, a spouse was not just a companion but a partner in the work of daily life. Picture a village wedding on a spring morning. The whole community gathers because everyone is invested in the union. A simple procession moves from the bride's house to the small parish church where vows are spoken before priest and neighbours alike. Afterwards there is feasting, bread, cheese, ale, perhaps a roasted pig if fortune allows. Children chase one another, musicians play pipes, and old women exchange knowing glances about how the marriage will fare. The celebration is lively, but it is less about romance than about unity. Two families have joined. Two lineages now share fate. The village takes notice. For the nobility, matters were still more transactional, though carried out with greater ceremony. Marriages among lords and ladies were tools of politics. They sealed peace between feuding neighbours, secured trade routes, or brought new lands into a family's control. A daughter might be promised as part of an alliance, her hand negotiated like a chess move across parchment contracts. Kings and princes were especially strategic, arranging unions that could shape the destinies of entire realms. A noble bride often arrived at her wedding as a young teenager, veiled and surrounded by her family's retainers. She might never have spoken more than a few words to her intended husband. In some cases, she had never met him at all before the ceremony. The priest would join their hands, prayers would be spoken, and the marriage was sealed. Affection was something to be discovered later, if at all. The family's concern was not whether she would be happy, but whether she would bear heirs, manage her household, and preserve the reputation of her lineage. Supervision was a constant presence in courtship. Young women were rarely allowed to meet potential suitors alone. A mother, an aunt, or even a group of neighbours might hover close by. In villages, flirtations at wells or dances were tolerated only under many watchful eyes. Among nobles, encounters were even more carefully arranged. Courtship was less a private adventure than a public performance carried out under scrutiny and often dictated by others. And yet, despite the weight of contracts and expectations, love still found small cracks in which to grow. A peasant lad might carve a wooden token and slip it to a girl at the market. A nobleman might compose a verse in the style of the troubadours, leaving it where his lady might find it. Couples learned to steal moments, walking together at dusk, sharing glances during a feast, speaking softly in the spaces between duty. These were the unsanctioned side quests of medieval life, small rebellions against the greater machinery of family and church. The risks of such affection were real. To be caught kissing behind a barn could mean public penance or a fine. In some cases, it could mean a furious father arriving with a pitchfork and a demand for immediate marriage. Gossip was a powerful weapon. In small communities, reputations were fragile and a hint of impropriety could linger for years. Among the nobility, scandal could destroy alliances and provoke feuds that lasted generations. Marriage was not only personal, it was political, and every whisper carried weight. Still, the idea that love could blossom within or alongside these arrangements remained powerful. Stories of couples who defied their parents to marry for affection, though rare, were remembered with admiration. Songs of courtly love, though idealized, gave language to feelings that ordinary people surely recognized. While the official structures of marriage were rigid, the human heart continued to hope for more than duty. Imagine then the rhythm of a medieval household built on such a foundation. A husband and wife rise with the dawn, tend to fields or oversee servants, prepare meals or manage accounts. Their partnership is practical, their roles distinct, their responsibilities heavy. But perhaps as years pass, they learn one another's rhythms. Perhaps affection grows in the sharing of burdens, in the raising of children, in the quiet comfort of familiar presence. In such cases, love was not the basis of marriage, but the harvest of it, something that grew slowly in the soil of necessity. It is tempting to think of this as cold, but it was not without its own form of warmth. In a world where survival often depended on cooperation, companionship was its own kind of love. And when true affection did arise, it was all the more cherished for having endured so many constraints. So when we look back on medieval courtship and marriage, we see less of candlelit dinners and whispered confessions and more of contracts, negotiations, and public oversight. Yet within that framework, ordinary men and women still found ways to carve out moments of tenderness. The church could prescribe rules, families could make bargains, but the heart was stubborn. It found ways to speak even softly, even in the quiet corners of a crowded hall. And as you drift deeper into rest, you may picture such a scene, a village wedding beneath spring blossoms, the air filled with laughter and music, while somewhere at the edge of the crowd a young couple steals a glance, knowing that even in a world bound by duty, love still lingers, waiting patiently for its turn. Before we move further, it is soothing and helpful to set aside one of the most persistent images attached to the medieval world, the iron chastity belt. You may have seen it in cartoons, in costume dramas, or behind glass in a dim museum gallery. Hinged plates, a small key, and the suggestion of absolute control. It is a powerful picture, tidy and scandalous at once. But the quiet truth reached, when we listen carefully to the sources, is that this object belongs mostly to later imaginations, not to the everyday Middle Ages. If chastity belts had been a common feature of medieval life, we would expect to find them everywhere in the record. Tailors would have listed them, blacksmiths would have priced them, church courts so quick to record the smallest scandal would have mentioned them frequently. Sermons would have thundered about them, and merchants would have shipped them. Instead, the medieval manuscripts that preserve so many awkward details are almost entirely silent. The silence is telling. It suggests not a hidden practice, but a thing that simply was not there. Most of the physical examples that people point to today come from centuries after the medieval period, from the Renaissance, and quite often from the 19th century, when collectors and moralists alike enjoyed imagining a more repressed, grotesquely disciplined past. In that era, cabinets of curiosity and playful exhibitions transformed rumor into artifact. Ironmongers could fashion a belt as a novelty, a warning, or a joke. Museums could place it under glass, and visitors could lean in with a shiver. The display told a story the audience already wanted to believe. A modern object was given a medieval caption, and the label did the rest. There are other reasons to doubt the practicality of such devices. Consider hygiene in a time when regular bathing was rare and infection a constant risk. Imagine enclosing the body in rough metal for days or weeks. Even without turning the mind to discomfort, the medical problems would have been immediate, inescapable, and dangerous. The design, when we look at it with a calm, practical eye, makes poor sense for the living body. Locks rust. Skin needs air. Life requires movement. So where did the myth take root? Partly in satire. Later, artists and writers sometimes poked fun at jealous husbands by drawing impossible contraptions, sketches meant to raise a smile rather than report a fact. partly in moralizing. As Europe entered the centuries of stricter public manners and complicated gender ideals, it became fashionable to imagine an earlier age as cruder and more extreme. The chastity belt fit this story perfectly, an emblem of absolute restraint, a visible symbol of private control. It reassured modern viewers that they had progressed even as they gazed with fascination at the supposed device of a bygone age. If we step back into the real medieval world, the tools of enforcing fidelity were familiar and entirely human. Families arranged marriages to knit alliances tightly. Reputations were watched by neighbors whose memories were long and whose tongues were quick. The church spoke in sermons and heard confessions. Towns fined offenders, and households wrapped their daughters and daughters-in-law in a web of supervision and obligation. Chaperones shadowed noble ladies. Village lanes carried gossip like wind carries smoke, and the cost of scandal, a lost dowry, a broken betrothal, a lawsuit discouraged many from risky choices. No iron plates were needed when honor, property, and the rhythm of a community's judgment already pressed so closely. Think for a moment of a noble household, its corridors busy with servants and stewards. A lady walks from hall to chapel with 2 attendants at her side. A clerk notes her hours, a confessor inquires after her soul, and a mother or aunt manages her letters. In such a setting, it is not iron that secures reputation, but watchfulness, ritual, and rank. Or picture a village where the market is the newsfeed and every action is observed. Doors stand open, children run everywhere. The sound of a cough carries through thin walls. Here, privacy is the exception, and the fear of a whisper is a better lock than any key. Even when the image of the belt appears in later centuries, it often carries the wink of performance. A woodcut shows a husband with an absurd key, a visual joke that tells us more about the artist's audience than about medieval women. A museum in the 19th century places a steel contraption on a velvet cushion, part curiosity, part cautionary tale, and visitors murmur, half horrified, half entertained. The object becomes a mirror for modern anxieties, reflecting judgments about desire, purity, and control, while claiming the authority of the past. There is value in gently untangling such myths. When we do, we begin to see medieval women and men not as caricatures under iron lock, but as subtle, resourceful people, negotiating familiar pressures, family expectation, religious teaching, the desire to belong, and the longing to be loved. We see households managing reputations with dinners and dowries, not devices. We see that restraint, when it came, was enforced by custom, by law, by the crowded nearness of daily life. And there is comfort too in letting the heavy object drop away. The Middle Ages need no sensational props to be interesting. The true textures are already rich: wool and linen, parchment and wax bells, and bread calendars marked with feasts and fasts. The rhythm of their lives, the rhythm we keep returning to, was shaped by seasons, by labor, by prayer, by the eyes of neighbors, and by the quiet, persistent wishes of the heart. So when you next pass a photograph of a chastity belt in a book or see one under glass, you can let the mind rest easily. The odds are high that you are looking not at a medieval necessity, but at a later imagination, an artifact of how people in other times chose to see the past. The real Middle Ages were more ordinary and more human. Fidelity was guarded by doors that were never quite closed, by mothers who never grew tired of watching, by priests who wrote more than they should have, and by communities that remembered everything. In the hush of this understanding, the medieval bedroom becomes simpler and somehow kinder, a place where duty and affection coexisted, where rules met reality, and where trust, however imperfect, mattered more than metal. Let the myth loosen its hold and drift away like steam from a cooling kettle. What remains is the quieter truth, and it is enough. When we leave behind the crowded streets of towns and the guarded households of nobles, another part of medieval life opens up with an entirely different rhythm. It is a rhythm shaped not by the bustle of markets or the chatter of neighbors, but by bells tolling across quiet cloisters, by parchment waiting for ink, and by voices deliberately kept still. To enter a monastery in the Middle Ages was to step into a carefully arranged world of order, repetition, and silence, where time itself was measured by prayer and the written word was a kind of devotion. Imagine the stone walls of a Benedictine abbey. They rise without ornament on the outside, a solid grey rectangle against green fields or forest edges. But inside the heart of the place is not the grand church alone, it is the cloister, a square of open air framed by covered walkways. The monks pass along these paths slowly, their black or brown habits brushing against columns. The air smells of damp stone herbs from the garden and beeswax from the candles. Silence is expected here except for the prayers that punctuate the day. Each gesture is part of a pattern that stretches back centuries, a living echo of rules first written by Saint Benedict in the 6th century. The rule of Saint Benedict prescribed balance, prayer, study, and labour. Monks rose in the night for matins, returned to their beds for a short rest, then rose again with dawn for lauds. The bell marked each hour with gentle authority. None of this was hurried. The steady, deliberate pace was designed to quiet the body and still the mind, to fold human restlessness into a fabric of devotion. For those who joined such a community, the world outside, the quarrels of lords, the fairs, the noise of politics fell away. Inside, the days stretched long and calm, identical and yet filled with small acts of meaning. Among these acts, writing was one of the most enduring. The scriptorium or writing room was a place of hushed concentration. Wooden desks stood by narrow windows admitting slants of cold daylight. Each monk bent over parchment, dipping quills into ink made from oak galls and soot-tracing letters with careful strokes. The air carried a faint scratching sound like the breathing of the building itself. Mistakes were costly, parchment was precious. A single book could take months, even years to complete. To copy words was to preserve memory, to weave threads that linked past to present. The manuscripts created here were not only religious texts. Alongside psalters and gospels, monks copied works of philosophy, medicine, astronomy, and law. Classical authors survived because some quiet scribe found worth in them, inscribing the words letter by letter, margin by margin. Each volume was a patient gift to the future. When you hold a medieval manuscript today in a museum or library, you hold not just words but the evidence of long hours of devotion, in silence of lamps burning through winter evenings of steady hands, practicing fidelity to a page. Illumination, the art of decorating books with color and gold, brought another dimension to this work. In some monasteries, painters and scribes worked side by side. Letters unfurled with curling vines, tiny beasts clung to the margins, saints glowed with halos touched in gold leaf. Yet even here the purpose was not flamboyance. Illumination was a meditation, a way to turn letters into prayers, to make the page a sacred object. Readers few though they were encountered the text as both knowledge and vision, each glance a reminder of the divine order. The silence of the cloister was not absolute. Monks spoke when necessary, but speech was limited, often replaced by a language of gestures. Silence was not an emptiness, but a discipline, a way of taming desire, of allowing prayer to speak in place of chatter. In the refectory, as brothers ate their meals of bread, beans, or fish, one monk would read aloud from a book while the rest listened in quiet. Eating became another form of learning. Words entered through the ears as food entered through the mouth. Both were nourishment, both sustained. Daily labor took many forms, tending vineyards, brewing ale, cultivating herbs, or caring for the sick. But the hours always returned to prayer. The bells summoned them again and again, 7 times each day and once more in the night. Each service, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline, was a reminder that the world was not chaotic but ordered, aligned with heaven's rhythm. The repetition could lull the restless heart, steadying it like a rocking cradle. For lay people outside the monastery, the abbey was a landmark of stability. Villagers might pass by and hear the chanting through open windows. Pilgrims stopped to ask for food or shelter. The sick sought remedies from monks who tended gardens of medicinal plants, sage, mint, fennel, and comfrey. In a world often unsettled by war or famine, the monastery stood like an anchor, quiet, enduring, always turning its hours to prayer. Over centuries, these communities preserved not only their faith but a storehouse of culture. Without the scribes of monasteries, entire traditions of thought would have vanished. Aristotle, Cicero, Galen all survived because some nameless monk leaned patiently over parchment and copied them for a future he would never see. In the stillness of the cloister, the wisdom of the ancient world slipped across time, sheltered by silence. It is calming to imagine such a place at dusk. The sun lowers, throwing pale gold across the cloister garth. The monks gather in the chapel, their chants rising and falling in tones that have shaped the air for generations. Outside, the world continues with its quarrels and worries. Inside, the rhythm holds the bell, the prayer, the quiet turning of a page. To drift into sleep with such an image is to borrow a little of their calm, to rest in the assurance that patience and silence once guarded human memory as carefully as walls guard a cloister. If monasteries represented order and silence, the rhythm of the countryside was measured by something even older and more unyielding, the turning of the seasons. Most people in the Middle Ages were not monks or nobles, but peasants tied to the land. Their lives unfolded in cycles of sowing and reaping, of long days under the sky, and long nights by the hearth where the crackle of the fire was the only sound against the dark. For them, history was not written in books or illuminated on parchment. It was etched into the soil beneath their feet and in the weather that decided their harvest. Picture a small village of perhaps 20 or 30 households clustered around a rough wooden church. Thatched roofs rise unevenly, smoke curling from holes cut in the thatch. Pigs wander through the muddy lane, chickens scratch at scraps, and children run barefoot between doorways. Life here is lived outdoors as much as indoors, and everyone's labor contributes. Fields stretch beyond, divided into strips, each family working their allotted land, but always as part of a collective whole. No one is entirely independent. Survival depends on cooperation. The seasons dictate every task. Spring means ploughing, often with oxen pulling wooden ploughs that barely scratch the earth. Seeds are sown carefully by hand, each gesture a hope for autumn. Summer is a time of tending, pulling weeds, repairing fences, watching the sky for signs of storm. Harvest in autumn is urgent and exhausting, the culmination of the year. Men, women, and children alike cut, bind, and gather often from dawn until the light fades. Grain is threshed with flails stored in barns if the village is fortunate, or shared out too soon if supplies are short. Winter brings quiet but also hunger as stores dwindle and meals grow thinner. The rhythm repeats year after year, lives braided tightly to the soil. Work was not the only rhythm. The village also turned on festivals and holy days, moments when the church calendar intersected with the farming one. Candlemas, Easter, Midsummer, harvest festivals, Christmas, each came with rituals, food, and a pause from labor. Even small breaks brought joy, the ringing of bells, the sharing of ale songs sung in the flickering light of a hearth. These were reminders that life was not only toil but also celebration, that community was strengthened by coming together. Peasant homes were modest. 1 or 2 rooms, walls of wattle and daub, roofs of straw. A central hearth provided heat and cooking, its smoke escaping through gaps in the roof. Furniture was minimal, benches, stools perhaps, a bed stuffed with straw. Animals sometimes shared the space in winter, their warmth a welcome presence. Privacy, as we understand it, did not exist. Families lived close, slept close, and worked close. Yet within this simplicity was resilience. Families learned to endure, to adapt, to find comfort in repetition. Diet was plain but sustaining. Bread formed the foundation, made from rye, barley, or oats rather than fine wheat, which was rare. Porridges and stews simmered with beans, peas, onions, leeks, or cabbage. Meat was occasional, a pig slaughtered at Martinmas, a chicken on a feast day. Milk, cheese, and butter supplemented the table when possible. Ale was the common drink, safer than water, brewed in small batches within homes. Every meal, no matter how humble, reflected the land's yield and the family's fortune. Hardship was constant, disease spread quickly in cramped villages. A poor harvest meant hunger, sometimes famine. Lords demanded rents or labor services, reminding peasants that their work was not entirely their own. Yet endurance was part of their world. A bad year could be survived with help from neighbors, with shared bread, with mutual labor. Communities were bound together by necessity, and within that necessity grew bonds of familiarity and care. Children began working early, tending animals, fetching water, gathering wood. Play was not absent, though it appeared in games, with sticks, in songs, in chasing each other through fields. Old age, if reached, was respected, but few grew truly old. Lives were shorter, yes, but also fuller in the sense of constant work, constant presence in the cycle of nature. To rest was rare, to endure was expected. Religion shaped the peasant imagination as surely as the weather. The church stood at the center of the village, not only physically but spiritually. Sermons reminded villagers of heaven and hell, of saints and salvation. Images painted on church walls made these lessons vivid. Bells marked the hours of prayer, binding the rhythm of devotion to the rhythm of work. Even the land itself was threaded with the sacred fields blessed before sowing, candles carried through meadows to protect crops, saints' days linked with planting or harvest. Faith did not float above life, it was woven into the soil and the sky. If you close your eyes, you might picture the end of a peasant day. The sun sets the fields quiet. Families gather around a fire, the smell of stew filling the small house. Children drift to sleep on straw beds, while adults whisper about the weather, about the next day's tasks, about the uncertainty of winter. Outside, the dark stretches across the land, dotted only by the faint glow of hearths. Life is fragile, yet it continues year by year, held together by shared labor, by ritual, by hope. There is something soothing in imagining that steady rhythm, the way each season carries its own duties, the way communities leaned on each other, the way life, though difficult, had a certain balance. As you drift into rest, you might imagine that you too are part of such a village where tomorrow's work is clear, where the pattern repeats, and where survival depends not on wealth or power, but on the quiet endurance of ordinary people. If the village was the heart of peasant life, the manor was the framework in which it all existed. A medieval village rarely stood on its own. It was almost always tied to a larger estate, a manor under the authority of a local lord. This lord might live nearby in a fortified hall or even in a castle if the land was wealthy or strategically important. His presence was felt everywhere, not only in stone walls and timber halls, but in the rents paid, the obligations owed, and the shadow of authority that lingered over every strip of farmland. The manor was both a home and an institution. At its simplest, it was the lord's house, sometimes large, sometimes modest, but always distinct from the cottages of peasants. A hall with timber beams, a hearth large enough to roast whole animals, and perhaps a chapel stood at its core. Surrounding it were barns, stables and granaries, buildings that revealed the lord's wealth in stored grain and livestock. A moat or ditch might encircle the manor, not only for defence but also to signify separation between the ruling household and the tenants beyond. Yet the manor was more than a physical place, it was a system. Within its bounds, peasants held their land not as absolute owners but as tenants owing service or rent to the lord. This could take many forms. Some worked the demesne, the lord's personal fields, for a set number of days each year. Others paid with a portion of their harvest or with coin if they were fortunate enough to have access to markets. Still others owed boon work, extra labor at critical times like planting and harvest. The obligations varied, but the pattern was the same. The land was not free, and the right to farm it was bound to duties owed upward. For the lord, the manor was both livelihood and symbol. His wealth came not only from his tenants' rents, but from their labor, which sustained his household and underpinned his social standing. Hospitality was expected of him, to feed visitors, to maintain his hall as a center of authority, to host feasts on great occasions. His household included not just family, but also stewards, reeves and servants who managed the estate. The reeve, often a peasant himself, acted as an intermediary, ensuring that obligations were met and disputes resolved. Justice was part of the manor's rhythm too, as local courts heard cases about land theft disputes or broken obligations. In this way, the manor governed daily life as surely as it governed land. For peasants, obligations could feel heavy, yet they also provided structure. The manor court was a place to resolve quarrels, to formalize marriages or inheritances, to regulate the use of common land. The lord's authority was rarely questioned openly, but it was not without limits. Customs bound him as well as his tenants. In many places, rights were preserved by memory and tradition: the right to gather firewood in certain woods, to graze animals on common pasture, to fish in streams. These rights mattered deeply, for they made survival possible. If you imagine a day on the manor, it might begin with the lord's steward overseeing work on the domain fields. Peasants gather tools in hand to fulfill their labor duty. The reeve counts them, records who is present, who is absent. The work is done under watchful eyes, for the lord's yield sustains his household and his prestige. At the same time, life in the village continues: women baking bread, children tending geese, old men mending tools. The manor ties it all together, binding labor, obligation, and authority into a single web. The manor's role extended beyond agriculture. It was a place of defense, its hall or small castle providing shelter in times of unrest. It was a place of patronage, where the lord supported the local church-sponsored festivals or granted charity to the poor on feast days. It was a place of culture too, where minstrels might be welcomed, where stories were told by firelight, where even the simplest feast carried echoes of tradition. The manor embodied hierarchy, but it also anchored community. The social order it represented was not static, though it often felt that way. Lords depended on their peasants as much as peasants depended on the lord's protection. A bad harvest or a time of famine could expose this mutual reliance, for without tenants, the land was nothing. And without the land, the lord's power dissolved. Stability rested on balance, delicate though it was. Picture, if you will, the manor at dusk. The lord and his household dine in the great hall, the light of torches dancing on wooden beams. Servants move quietly, carrying platters of bread, meat, and ale. Outside in the village below, peasants gather by their own hearths, their meals simpler but no less essential. Both lives, though separate in wealth and comfort, are woven into the same pattern. The manor stands above, but it cannot stand alone. There is a quietness to this arrangement, a kind of order that repeated across Europe, from England to France, from the Rhineland to Poland. It gave structure to daily life, bound communities into larger systems, and preserved traditions for generations. To imagine it is to see a world where power and labor, authority and endurance were joined together in the shape of the land itself. And as the seasons turned, so too did the life of the manor, steady and unyielding, a rhythm that endured across centuries. If the manor was the framework of earthly authority, the church was the framework of the soul. In nearly every medieval village, no matter how small or remote, a church stood at its center. Sometimes it was a humble building of timber and thatch, its walls whitewashed and simple. In wealthier places it rose in stone with a square tower that could be seen for miles, guiding travelers like a beacon across the fields. Whether modest or grand, the church was not only a place of worship, but a constant presence in the lives of the villagers, shaping time, belief, and identity. The sound of bells marked the rhythm of days. Morning bells might call the faithful to prayer at dawn. Midday bells sounded when the sun was high, and evening bells drew villagers to pause before darkness fell. These bells did more than signal devotion. They structured the passage of time for a community where most people had no clocks. The tolling reminded peasants when to stop work, when to gather, and when to turn thoughts from the furrow to the divine. In this way, the sacred rhythm was woven into ordinary tasks, binding heaven and earth in the same cycle. The church itself was both sanctuary and stage. Inside, cool stone or timber walls enclosed a space marked by candles and simple decoration. A crucifix stood above the altar, and painted images of saints sometimes adorned the walls. These images were more than ornament. They were teaching tools. In a world where few could read, art told the stories of the Bible of martyrs and miracles of sin and redemption. A villager might pause before a painted saint to ask for protection in childbirth or strength to endure hunger or mercy for a lost loved one. Each prayer carried into the still air, mingling with the scent of beeswax and incense. The parish priest, often the only man in the village who could read Latin, acted as both spiritual guide and mediator of worldly concerns. He baptized infants, blessed marriages, and stood at gravesides to commend souls to God. He also taught by sermon, explaining the mysteries of faith in words that peasants could grasp. Some priests were learned and devout, others less so, but all stood as bridges between the earthly village and the unseen world. Their presence was indispensable, for the church governed not only rituals but also morality, customs, and festivals. The calendar itself was defined by sacred time. Sundays brought rest, though for many peasants it meant a pause from work rather than full leisure. Feast days punctuated the year, honoring saints or holy events with special services, processions, or celebrations. Candlemas, Easter, Pentecost, All Saints, these days carried meaning beyond their names. They offered respite from labor chances for gathering and reminders of divine presence. At harvest, villagers might bring offerings of grain to be blessed. At times of plague or famine, they might process through the fields praying for mercy. The cycle of faith was inseparable from the cycle of life. The churchyard, too, was a central space. It was here that villagers were laid to rest, their graves marked with wooden crosses or simple stones. To walk through the churchyard was to walk among generations, to feel the continuity of family and community. It was also a meeting place where people gathered after Mass to speak, arrange marriages, settle disputes, or hear announcements. The sacred and the social intermingled, for the church was not apart from daily life but at its heart. Consider the sounds of a Sunday morning in such a place. The bell tolls carrying across fields still damp with dew. Families walk together, children clutching their parents' hands. Inside, the priest chants in Latin, the villagers kneel and stand in response, the air heavy with incense. The language may be strange to their ears, but the gestures are familiar, the pattern comforting. At the end, people spill out into the churchyard, exchanging news, arranging work for the week, or sharing gossip by the lich gate. Faith and fellowship are woven together in a seamless tapestry. The influence of the church extended further still. It shaped law, teaching that oaths sworn on holy relics were binding, that certain days must be kept free of labor, that almsgiving was a duty. It shaped education for monasteries and cathedrals, preserved learning, though for the average villager this remained distant. It shaped imagination, filling dreams with angels, demons, miracles, and visions of heaven and hell. The unseen world was as real to them as the soil beneath their feet, and the church gave it form and guidance. It is important to remember, too, that religion was not only solemn. Feast days could be joyful with dancing, games, and shared meals. At Christmas, a log might burn through the night. At Easter, candles lit the dark. At midsummer, fires blazed high on the hills. These were times of laughter and warmth, when the sacred blended with the celebratory, when faith was not only prayer but also community joy. Imagine the church at night when all is quiet. The candles extinguished, the doors closed, the bell silent until morning. The graves outside lie under the stars, and the walls hold within them centuries of whispered prayers. The villagers sleep in their cottages nearby, but the presence of the church remains constant, like a watchful guardian. It is not simply a building of stone or wood, but a vessel of memory, hope, and belonging. And so in the medieval village, the church was more than a place to worship. It was the keeper of time, the guide of conscience, the heart of gatherings, the anchor of tradition. Its bells echoed through fields and mines alike, reminding each villager that their days, however hard, were part of a larger order, one that reached beyond the furrows of earth to the mysteries of eternity. Beyond the bustle of the village and the fields, there were places set apart, enclosed behind walls of stone or timber, where a different rhythm of life unfolded. These were the monasteries, abbeys, and priories scattered across the medieval landscape like islands of prayer and contemplation. For the ordinary villager, the monastery was both a distant mystery and a nearby presence. Its bells could be heard across the countryside, and its monks or nuns might be glimpsed when they came to market or offered alms, yet the life inside remained cloistered and strange to those who tilled the soil. A monastery was often laid out in a square with a church at its heart and cloisters, enclosing quiet gardens or covered walkways. Dormitories, refectories and libraries clustered around their walls, thick and cool, designed to shield the world outside. Within these spaces, monks or nuns followed a daily cycle known as the rule, most often the rule of Saint Benedict. It was a rhythm of prayer work and study repeated with steady regularity from dawn to dusk and into the night. The day began in darkness, with the sound of bells summoning the community to matins prayers sung in the still hours before dawn. Later came Lauds prime terce, sext non vespers and compline, each marking a pause for worship. These hours were not simply times on a clock, but sacred divisions of the day, binding earthly life to divine praise. Between prayers, monks worked tending fields, copying manuscripts, brewing ale, or caring for the sick. Each task was seen not as ordinary labor, but as an offering part of the service to God. For those who lived outside the monastery, often seemed a place of otherworldly calm. While villagers struggled with hunger, weather, and toil, monks lived in regulated order, their needs provided by the land the monastery owned. Yet monasteries were not idle havens. Many became centers of learning, preserving texts of theology, philosophy, medicine, and history. In the scriptorium, monks bent over parchment by the light of oil lamps, their pens scratching out lines of Latin, their fingers stained with ink. Gold leaf and bright pigments adorned the pages of illuminated manuscripts, turning words into art. These works carried knowledge across generations, allowing voices of the ancient world to whisper into the medieval ear. Nunneries offered a similar but distinct life for women. Some were born into noble families and entered as a way of devoting themselves to God. Others sought refuge from unwanted marriages or a safe place after widowhood. Inside convent walls, women prayed, taught young girls, and sometimes became powerful leaders in their own right, overseeing estates and guiding communities. Figures such as Hildegard of Bingen remind us that nuns could be not only devoted but also learned, composing music, writing treatises, and corresponding with rulers. The monastery also served the broader community. Villagers came for healing when illness struck, for monks often kept gardens of herbs and studied remedies. Travelers found shelter in the guest house, where hospitality was considered a sacred duty. The poor received alms, bread, or clothing distributed at the gates. In times of famine, monasteries sometimes opened their stores, though not always with equal generosity. Still, for many, these enclosed communities were both spiritual guardians and practical lifelines. The silence of the cloister was a defining feature. Monks often refrained from idle speech, choosing instead to communicate with signs or with careful words. The silence was not emptiness, but fullness, meant to open the heart to prayer and contemplation. To walk the cloister was to feel time slow, the echo of footsteps merging with the rustle of leaves in the central garden, the hum of bees near flowering herbs, the murmur of psalms chanted in the nearby chapel. It was a different world, one both apart from and connected to the lives beyond its walls. Of course, not all monasteries lived up to their ideals. Some grew wealthy from gifts of land and tithes, their abbots wielding power like lords. Critics accused them of forgetting simplicity, of indulging in comfort rather than discipline. Reform movements arose to restore austerity, leading to new orders such as the Cistercians, who sought a return to plainness, building abbeys in remote valleys, their architecture stark yet beautiful in its simplicity. These cycles of wealth, critique, and renewal remind us that even in places of prayer, human nature remained present, striving between devotion and desire. Imagine the life of a monk at the close of day. The sun sinks behind the hills, shadows lengthen across the cloister walk. The final office compline gathers the brothers into the darkened chapel. Candles flicker against stone walls as chants rise into the quiet air, solemn and steady. Afterwards, silence deepens. The monks retire to their dormitory, lying on simple pallets, the cool of night settling in. Outside, owls call in the woods, while within the rhythm of prayer and rest continues as it has for centuries. For the medieval world, monasteries were not merely retreats. They were reservoirs of memory, of knowledge, of devotion. They stood as reminders that beyond the daily struggle of fields and markets, there were lives given wholly to contemplation, to order, to service. To the villager who glimpsed their towers in the distance, the monastery was a symbol of something enduring and unchanging, a place where prayers were said not only for the monks themselves, but for all souls in the surrounding land. In this way, monasteries were threads in the vast tapestry of medieval life, different from the village, yet inseparable from it. Their bells joined the bells of parish churches, their prayers mingled with the whispered prayers of peasants, their manuscripts preserved stories that would otherwise be lost. They were and remained quiet witnesses to a world both fragile and resilient, rooted in earth, yet reaching always toward the divine. There was another path through the medieval world that wound far beyond the fields of home or the walls of a monastery. It was the path of pilgrimage, a journey of faith that carried men and women, rich and poor, across miles of countryside and even across borders toward shrines, relics, and holy sites. For the villager who rarely left the bounds of the parish, the decision to take up a staff and set out on pilgrimage was an extraordinary moment, both an act of devotion and an adventure filled with uncertainty. The reasons for pilgrimage were many. Some sought healing, believing that contact with the relics of a saint might cure illness or ease pain. Others walked to fulfill a vow promised in times of danger or gratitude. A merchant might travel to Santiago de Compostela after surviving a storm at sea. A widow might go to Canterbury in hope of interceding prayers for her husband's soul. And for many, pilgrimage was simply part of the rhythm of faith, a chance to step beyond the ordinary and draw closer to the holy. The great routes of Europe stretched like threads across the map. To Santiago in Spain, pilgrims followed the Camino, crossing mountains, rivers, and plains. To Rome, they came from every corner of Christendom, converging on the tombs of Peter and Paul. To Canterbury, they travelled from across England, seeking the shrine of Thomas Becket, whose martyrdom had captured the imagination of a continent. And above all, to Jerusalem, pilgrims yearned to walk where Christ had walked, though the journey was long, perilous, and often impossible in times of war. On the road, pilgrims were recognizable by their simple garb. A wide-brimmed hat shaded their faces, a cloak shielded them from rain, and a wooden staff steadied their steps. Around their necks they wore tokens, scallop shells for Santiago, lead badges stamped with the image of a saint for other shrines. These tokens were both souvenirs and proofs of the journey, tangible signs that one had travelled, prayed, and returned. Life on the road was filled with hardship. Pilgrims slept in barns, in fields, or in crowded hospices run by monasteries and towns. Food was often coarse, bread, cheese, perhaps a little ale or watered wine. Bandits lurked in forests and storms could sweep across mountain passes, yet the journey also held companionship. Pilgrims from many places walked together, their conversations, a mixture of languages, their stories shared by the fire at night. In such company, the world seemed larger horizons, wider than the bounds of one's village. The destination, the holy shrine, was the heart of the pilgrimage. To arrive after days or weeks on the road was to step into a place thick with meaning. Candles flickered before relics, bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, vials of holy oil. The air was filled with incense and prayer, the murmur of petitions rising from hundreds of voices. Pilgrims touched the reliquaries, pressed tokens against them, or left offerings of coins, wax, or cloth. The experience was both physical and spiritual, a union of body and soul after the weariness of the road. For some, miracles were reported. The lame claimed to walk the sick, to recover the sorrowful, to find peace. Whether these were seen as divine intervention or as the healing power of belief, they added to the power of the pilgrimage. Stories spread, inspiring new waves of travellers, and the shrines grew in fame and wealth. Churches expanded to accommodate the throngs, adding chapels and crypts, carving images of saints into stone so that even those who could not read might know their stories. Yet pilgrimage was not only about saints and miracles, it was also about the encounter with the world. A villager from a small hamlet might for the first time see cities with soaring cathedrals, markets filled with goods from distant lands, and rivers spanned by mighty bridges. He might hear new dialects, taste new foods, or witness customs unlike his own. Pilgrimage was thus both religious and cultural, widening the horizons of those who undertook it. The Church encouraged pilgrimage as a way of penance and devotion, but it also became a form of economy. Inns and taverns lined the roads, merchants sold tokens and relics, some genuine, many forged, and towns prospered from the constant flow of travelers. Entire villages might thrive simply because they lay on a route to a shrine. This blend of commerce and faith created a world in which the sacred and the ordinary were entwined as prayers and coins alike flowed through the hands of pilgrims. For the pilgrim, though, what remained was often a memory of the journey itself. The sound of bells calling from distant towns, the long walk beneath summer heat or winter frost, the faces of companions who became friends, and above all, the sense of being part of something greater than oneself. To walk the road of pilgrimage was to step into a tradition stretching across centuries, to know that one's own footsteps echoed those of countless souls who had walked before. Imagine the return of a pilgrim to his village. He enters at dusk, weary but transformed, carrying the shell or badge that proves his journey. Neighbors gather to hear stories, to touch the token, to marvel at the courage of one who has walked so far. The pilgrim speaks of vast cathedrals, of strangers who became companions of the holy shrine, where prayers were whispered among thousands. And as he speaks, his world and the world of his listeners grows just a little larger, more connected, more filled with mystery. Pilgrimage was in its essence a journey outward and a journey inward. Outward across roads and fields, rivers and mountains. Inward into the soul toward repentance, renewal, and a closer bond with the divine. For medieval people, it was one of the deepest ways to step beyond the ordinary, to weave their own lives into the great tapestry of faith. If pilgrimage carried men and women along the sacred roads of faith, the hum of markets and fairs carried them into the very heart of earthly exchange. In the Middle Ages, trade was not only about the exchange of goods, it was also about the weaving together of communities, the rhythm of buying and selling that punctuated the seasons of the year, and the meeting of distant worlds in a single square. For the medieval villager, a weekly market or an annual fair was a chance to step into a world far larger than the narrow fields of home. Markets were most often held in the shadow of a church tower or within the walls of a growing town. There, merchants and peasants mingled, their stalls spread with goods that reflected both the familiar and the exotic. A farmer's wife might sell eggs or butter. A shepherd might bring fleeces of wool. Next to them, a potter displayed his wares, jugs, bowls, and tiles, their clay fired in smoky kilns. The air smelled of bread baked that morning, of salted fish brought in from the coast, of leather beeswax and ale. For many who came, simply walking among these sights and scents was to enter a world of wonder. Beyond the everyday goods, there were also glimpses of distant lands. Spices arrived from caravans that had crossed deserts, cinnamon, pepper, cloves, each measured in tiny amounts more valuable than their weight in gold. Fine cloth came from Italy and Flanders, silk from the east, and occasionally trinkets of ivory or amber. To see such things was to be reminded that the village was not the entire world, but only one part of a vast web of exchange stretching from England to the Levant, from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. The great fairs were even more remarkable. These were not the weekly gatherings of local folk, but vast events drawing merchants, nobles, and pilgrims alike. The fairs of Champagne in France were renowned throughout Europe. There, merchants from across the continent met to trade goods on a scale unimaginable in a village market. A Florentine banker might strike a bargain with a Flemish cloth merchant. A German trader might exchange barrels of herring for fine wines from Burgundy. These fairs were not only centers of commerce, but also of finance. It was here that early forms of banking and credit developed, allowing money to flow across borders without the danger of carrying heavy coins along treacherous roads. For the common folk, the fair was as much entertainment as trade. Jugglers, musicians, and storytellers gathered to perform, filling the air with laughter and song. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves to see dancing bears or to taste sweetmeats rarely found at home. The fair was also a place for news tales of battles fought far away, of kings crowned, of saints canonized, and of rumors from distant lands. To attend was to step into a river of information where the world seemed both larger and closer at once. The architecture of trade-shaped towns themselves. Streets were named after their trades: Baker Street, Butchers Row, Tanner's Lane. Guild halls rose in the centres of towns, built by associations of craftsmen who regulated their trades, maintained standards, and cared for their members. To join a guild was to enter a brotherhood, one that gave protection in times of illness, arranged funerals, and celebrated feast days together. In such ways, commerce was tied not only to wealth, but also to community and identity. Coins passed from hand to hand, but not all trade was conducted with money. Barter remained common, especially in rural areas. A farmer might exchange a sack of grain for a new pair of shoes, or a shepherd might trade wool for salt. Gradually, though, as towns grew and coinage became more widespread, money bound together the transactions of daily life. Yet even then, each coin carried with it the mark of a king or lord, a reminder that commerce was never separate from power. Markets and fairs also had their rituals of trust. Weighing scales were carefully watched, measures inspected, and cheating punished. To ensure fairness, some towns appointed officials called ale conners, who tested the quality of beer, or assayers who checked the weight of bread. These roles, humble though they might seem, were essential in maintaining trust in a world where reputation was often the most valuable currency. Imagine for a moment walking into such a fair. The ground beneath your feet is trampled by thousands of shoes and hooves. The chatter of bargaining swells around you, voices in French, German, Italian, and tongues you cannot name. A merchant lifts a bolt of cloth, letting the sun shine through its weave to prove its quality. A farmer haggles fiercely over the price of oxen. Children dart between stalls, their laughter mixing with the clink of coins and the call of hawkers. All around you, life pulses in colour, sound, and movement, far beyond the quiet of your village lane. At day's end, the market quiets. Stalls are packed away, carts creak as they depart, and the square is left with scraps of straw and trampled earth. But what remains in the minds of those who walked its paths is more than goods or bargains. It is the memory of having been part of a gathering, of stepping briefly into the great web of commerce that connected the medieval world. For many, these experiences were treasured, repeated in stories by the fire at night, reminders that life was richer and broader than the fields they tilled. Trade, whether in the humble form of eggs sold at market or in the grandeur of the champagne fairs, was one of the quiet forces that reshaped the medieval world. It brought distant lands into contact, wove together economies, and carried with it not only goods but also ideas, customs, and stories. In the exchange of bread and cloth, of wine and spices, medieval people found a rhythm that was at once ordinary and extraordinary, binding them to one another in ways they might never fully see yet always felt. If markets and fairs were the heartbeat of medieval exchange, then guilds were its steady skeleton, shaping the lives of craftsmen and artisans, defining standards and giving structure to the cities where trade flourished. In the villages, men and women worked their crafts within small cottages, often passing down skills from parent to child. But in towns and growing cities where streets were filled with the clang of hammers and the rasp of saws, guilds rose as associations that bound workers together, weaving pride, duty, and community into every trade. The word guild itself carried a sense of binding, of pledges and payments made into a common fund. A guild was at once a professional association, a religious brotherhood, and a social network. To be part of one meant not only the right to practice a craft, but also the security of belonging to a collective. The Weavers' Guild, the Tanners' Guild, the Blacksmiths' Guild, each oversaw its members, setting rules for apprenticeships, ensuring quality, and protecting the rights of craftsmen within the often uncertain world of medieval commerce. Apprenticeship formed the beginning of a craftsman's journey. A boy, and sometimes a girl, might be placed under the care of a master craftsman at the age of 12 or 13. There he would learn not only the secrets of the craft, but also the habits of discipline, service, and patience. Apprenticeship could last many years, during which the young worker lived in the household of the master, ate at his table, and often became almost a part of his family. Tasks began humbly sweeping the shop, tending the fire, carrying wood or water, before moving on to the finer skills of shaping wood, mixing dyes, or forging iron. Once the years of learning were complete, the apprentice became a journeyman. The word from the French journée, meaning day, reflected that these men were hired by the day, moving from workshop to workshop. As journeymen, they earned wages and gained experience, traveling if they could to see different towns, different methods, and different masters. Many journeymen undertook long journeys across countries, carrying their tools and their skill, seeking work in unfamiliar places. In doing so, they carried not only the methods of their craft, but also news, songs, and ideas from town to town, stitching together the cultures of medieval Europe. The final step was mastery. To become a master, a journeyman had to produce a masterpiece, a work of such quality that it demonstrated his full command of the craft. Whether a finely made chest, a woven cloth of perfect balance, or a gilded piece of metalwork, this masterpiece was judged by the guild, and only upon approval was the craftsman admitted as a master with the right to open his own shop, take apprentices, and display his sign in the town. For many, this moment was the crowning of years of toil, a recognition not only of skill but of belonging fully to the proud lineage of their trade. Guilds were not only about craft, they were also about faith and charity. Each guild had its patron saint, whose feast day was celebrated with processions, masses, and feasting. Members supported one another in times of sickness or poverty, paid for funerals, and offered prayers for the souls of the departed. The guild halls, often among the most splendid buildings in a town, stood as symbols of both economic strength and communal devotion. Inside, decisions were made about prices, wages, and rules, but also about charity festivals and the care of widows and orphans. Walk through a medieval town, and you might have heard the sounds of guild life spilling into the streets. From the goldsmith's quarter came the ring of tiny hammers on metal, sharp and rhythmic. From the tanner's yard came the pungent smell of hides being soaked and treated. The weavers' homes were filled with the steady clatter of looms, while bakers rose before dawn to knead and fire bread in communal ovens, ensuring that the city awoke to the smell of crust and grain. Each craft left its mark upon the senses of the town, creating a mosaic of sound, smell, and sight that reflected the unity and diversity of its people. Guilds also wielded power beyond the workshop. In many towns, they played a role in governance, their leaders sitting on councils, advising lords, or even ruling free cities in their own right. Wealthy guilds might finance the building of bridges, the repair of walls, or the endowment of chapels. The pride of work became pride of city, and through such associations, medieval towns carved out a degree of independence that made them vibrant centers of both trade and culture. Yet within the pride of craft lay quiet tensions. Guilds defended their privileges jealously, often excluding outsiders, women, and those of lower status from full participation. Rules could be strict, limiting innovation and punishing those who worked outside the bounds. The structure that gave security also sometimes became a cage. Still, for the majority who found within it identity, fellowship, and protection, the guild was a source of dignity. Imagine the life of a carpenter within such a guild. His mornings begin with the creak of the workshop shutters, the smell of fresh wood shavings, the careful sharpening of his tools. His apprentice sweeps the floor and sets the fire, while his journeyman planes planks smooth. The day is spent in measured work, creating tables, chairs, beams for houses, each piece shaped not only by hand but by the traditions of generations before him. At dusk he closes his shop, knowing that his work is not merely for himself, but part of a greater body, a guild that will defend his rights, honor his craft, and pray for his soul when he is gone. In such ways, guilds formed one of the quiet yet powerful currents of medieval life. They provided order in a world that could often seem uncertain, gave dignity to labor in an age where status was jealously guarded, and bound together craftsmen into a brotherhood that spanned generations. To speak of medieval work is to speak of the guilds whose pride of craft shaped not only the goods produced, but the very identity of the men and women who made them. And so, amid the noise of markets and the vastness of fairs, amid the towering castles and the quiet fields, there stood the guild halls and workshops of Europe. Within their walls, labour became art, trade became fellowship, and work became pride. In their patient rhythm of apprenticeship, journeyman's wanderings, and master's final achievement, we find one of the deepest stories of the medieval world, that of human hands shaping not only wood, stone, and cloth, but also shaping meaning, belonging, and legacy. Beyond the bustling towns and the ordered halls of guilds, the majority of people in the medieval world lived upon the land. Fields stretched across valleys and hillsides broken by hedgerows, woodlands, and the winding courses of rivers. Life in these villages followed the slow rhythm of the seasons, marked by the turning of the soil, the sowing of seeds, the careful tending of crops, and the long days of harvest. To understand the medieval countryside is to understand the very heartbeat of the age, for it was here that food was grown, traditions preserved, and the lives of countless men and women quietly unfolded. A village might seem small by modern standards, a scattering of houses around a church, perhaps a manor house nearby, and fields extending outward in strips. Yet for its inhabitants, it was the centre of their universe. The cottages were often simple timber frames, packed with wattle and daub-thatched roofs that needed frequent repair, small windows letting in limited light. Floors were hard earth, sometimes strewn with rushes, and furniture was minimal, fashioned by hand or handed down across generations. But within those walls, fires glowed, meals were shared, and children grew in the midst of stories, songs, and the hum of daily labour. The open field system dominated much of medieval agriculture. Land was divided into long, narrow strips scattered across different parts of the village fields, so that each family had a share of good soil and poor. This scattering prevented disputes and spread the risks of bad harvests. Families would work their strips side by side, men guiding ploughs pulled by oxen, women and children following with seed or bending low to pull weeds. The rhythm was communal, for no one worked in isolation. Fields were planted and harvested according to collective decisions, ensuring that the village prospered or suffered together. Season after season unfolded with duties both familiar and demanding. In the spring, ploughing and sowing filled the days, the heavy soil breaking beneath iron-tipped ploughs, the air thick with the smell of earth. Summer brought long hours of weeding, tending livestock and maintaining hedges. Autumn was the climax, when grain stood tall and ready for the sickle. Harvest was a time of both anxiety and festivity. Neighbours gathered to reap and bind sheaves to carry the golden bounty into barns. Songs and laughter mingled with sweat, and aching muscles for the harvest meant survival through the coming winter. Winter, though quieter, was never idle. Fields lay fallow or rested under frost, but livestock needed care, tools required repair, and wool was spun beside the hearth. In these months, stories lengthened, songs deepened, and people turned inward, sustaining themselves on salted meat, stored grain, and whatever vegetables and fruits had been preserved. Festivals broke the monotony. Christmas, Candlemas, and Shrovetide offered moments of feasting, dancing, and the breaking of ordinary routines. Animals were integral to rural life. Oxen provided the muscle to plough heavy soils, their patient pace guiding the year's work. Sheep gave wool, one of the most important commodities of the medieval economy, their fleeces sheared in summer and spun during the colder months. Cows offered milk, while pigs and chickens provided meat and eggs. To tend animals was to ensure survival, and much of a villager's day was spent feeding, guarding, and coaxing life from these humble companions. The village itself was a network of relationships. Families were bound not only by blood but by necessity. They shared tools, helped one another in the busiest seasons, and supported neighbours in times of illness or loss. Yet tensions could arise. Disputes over strips of land, grazing rights, or the use of woodland were common. These quarrels were often brought before the manorial court, presided over by the local lord or his steward. Here justice was dispensed in ways that reflected both custom and authority, reinforcing the structures that governed daily existence. Religion too shaped rural life profoundly. The village church was more than a building, it was the focal point of community. Its bells called people to mass, marked the passing hours, tolled for the dead, and rang out for festivals. Within its cool stone walls, villagers knelt before painted images of saints, whispered prayers for good weather, and brought offerings from their harvest. The churchyard with its graves and yew trees reminded all of the cycle of life and death, binding generations together in memory. The manor system framed this rural world. Many villagers were serfs bound to the land, owing labor or produce to their lord. On certain days they worked not their own strips, but the lord's demesne, ploughing his fields, gathering his harvest, mending his fences. In return they received protection, the right to farm their strips, and the stability of belonging to a larger whole. Though the obligations could be heavy and freedom restricted for many, the manor offered a measure of security in an uncertain age. Amid these labors and obligations, moments of joy and celebration still blossomed. Weddings, christenings, and feasts brought villagers together in music and dance. May Day saw young people weave garlands and dance around the maypole, while midsummer fires lit the night with flickering warmth. Storytellers wandered through, bringing tales of distant lands, while traveling musicians filled the air with song. Even in the hardest times, laughter echoed through cottages, children played with sticks and pebbles, and neighbors gathered around fires to share warmth and companionship. Imagine yourself in such a village. Dawn breaks with the crowing of roosters, mist clings to the fields, and the smell of wood smoke drifts from low chimneys. You step into the crisp air, oxen already lowing in the byre, neighbors greeting you with nods as they set to work. All day the fields echo with voices, with the scraping of tools and the cries of children at play. At dusk, weary yet satisfied, you return to the cottage where a simple meal waits, and the day ends with prayers whispered beneath flickering candlelight. This was the rhythm of rural life, steady, unhurried, demanding yet rich in its own quiet ways. It was a life bound by land and season, by the shared labor of community, and by the hope that each year's harvest would be enough. It was a world where survival was never taken for granted, where every loaf of bread, every fire lit, every garment spun was part of a larger cycle of endurance and continuity. In the measured pace of medieval countryside, we glimpse both the hardship and the beauty of lives lived close to the soil. It was not a world of luxury or ease, but it was a world of resilience, of belonging, and of a deep connection to the rhythms of nature. The fields and cottages, the animals and festivals, the labor and the laughter, all wove together into a pattern as enduring as the land itself. If villages formed the pulse of medieval life, castles were the towering symbols of authority that rose above the landscape. They were not only homes for lords and their families, but also strongholds of power centers of administration and visible reminders of order in a world often unsettled. To walk into the shadow of a castle was to step into a world where walls spoke of protection and dominance, and where stone itself seemed to whisper the stories of centuries. The earliest castles in much of Europe were modest by later standards, built quickly of timber and earth. Known as motte and bailey structures, they consisted of a raised mound, the motte topped by a wooden keep with a surrounding courtyard or bailey enclosed by palisades. These fortifications could be erected in weeks, offering swift defense in uncertain times. Yet wood decays and fire threatens, and so over time lords turned to stone. Thus rose the great keeps and curtain walls that still mark the landscapes of Britain, France, and beyond. A stone keep was a formidable structure, its walls thick enough to resist siege engines, its narrow windows designed for defense rather than comfort. Climbing the winding stairs, one would find great halls with timbered roofs, echoing chambers lit by candles and torches, and small chambers tucked into corners, their walls cold but their hearths flickering with firelight. The air carried a faint scent of smoke, and damp softened by rushes laid on the floors, and tapestries hung to insulate against draughts. Life within the castle followed a rhythm both similar to and distinct from village life. Servants bustled through corridors, carrying food from smoky kitchens to the high tables of lords and guests. Cooks prepared meals in vast fireplaces, turning spits of meat, boiling stews in heavy cauldrons, and baking bread in clay ovens. Guards patrolled battlements, their eyes scanning horizons for threat or opportunity, while craftsmen repaired armor-sharpened weapons and kept the castle's tools in readiness. The Great Hall was the heart of the castle, a space where feasts, councils, and ceremonies unfolded. By day, it might host petitions, disputes, and the business of governance, with villagers and vassals presenting grievances or obligations before the Lord. By evening, it transformed into a place of fellowship where trestle tables groaned beneath platters of roasted meat, trenchers of bread, and pitchers of ale. Music filled the air, minstrels strumming lutes or harps, singers lifting voices in tales of heroes long gone. By the glow of firelight, laughter mingled with the clink of cups, weaving together duty and delight. Yet castles were also places of quiet. Imagine walking through a courtyard at dawn. The air is crisp, the sky pale, and the walls rise silently around you. A few servants hurry across cobblestones, their footsteps muffled by frost. From the chapel comes the murmur of early prayers, the faint sound of a bell calling the faithful. In the stillness, the castle feels like a world unto itself, sealed off from the wider countryside, a place where the weight of stone meets the softness of daily ritual. Castles were symbols, but they were also deeply practical. They commanded the landscape positioned upon hills, cliffs, or river bends to maximize defense. Their towers offered vantage points. Their walls enclosed not only lords but also soldiers, craftsmen, and sometimes entire communities in times of danger. Within their walls were wells to supply water during siege, stores of grain and salted meat, and hidden posterns through which messengers might slip out unseen. Siege warfare was a grim reality of the medieval world, and castles bore its marks. Siege towers rolled across fields, catapults hurled stones against walls, and miners dug beneath foundations in hopes of collapse. Defenders poured boiling water or hurled stones from battlements, arrows raining from above. Yet most sieges were wars of patience, starvation, the enemy more than direct assault. The massive walls, the stout gates bound in iron, and the watchful eyes of defenders made castles both bulwarks and prisons when conflict lingered. But not every moment in a castle was defined by war. For the families who lived there, it was home. Children played in courtyards, chasing dogs or clambering over stone steps. Women managed households, overseeing servants, organizing stores of food, spinning or embroidering in solar chambers where sunlight filtered through narrow windows. Lords trained in the arts of war, practicing with sword and lance in practice yards, while falconers carried birds of prey to hunt across the countryside. The castle, for all its defences, was also a place of learning, leisure, and domestic life. Religion infused castle life as much as it did villages. Chapels were built within their walls where priests celebrated mass, blessed marriages, and prayed for the souls of both noble and servant. On feast days, the entire household gathered in solemnity, kneeling beneath painted images and listening to chants that echoed softly through stone. Candles flickered against carved altars, and the smell of incense mingled with the damp chill of the walls. Castles also projected a kind of psychological weight. For villagers, laboring in fields below the site of towering battlements reminded them of protection and of obligation. The lord within those walls was not just a neighbor, but a ruler, one whose decisions could shape lives, whose presence could bring security or burden. Yet for many, the castle was also a beacon, a symbol of order in a world where danger often lingered just beyond the horizon. Imagine for a moment being within such a place at night. Torches flicker along corridors, shadows dance against the cold stone. Outside, wind rattles against shutters, while within the fire, in the hall, crackles, sending warmth into the vast chamber. You walk slowly, the air cool and still, footsteps echoing softly. Above, the stars are hidden by battlements, and the silence of the thick walls wraps around you like a cloak. In that stillness, one feels the deep endurance of the castle, the way it has stood through storms, wars, and countless passing generations. In the end, castles were more than fortresses. They were living spaces where duty and survival mingled with joy and ritual, where stone carried the memory of both conflict and comfort. They stood as guardians of land and people, as statements of power, and as homes filled with the small, steady rhythms of human life. The walls that once guarded lords and ladies now guard memories, whispering softly to those who pause and listen. If the countryside was the bedrock of medieval life, and castles the towers of authority, then towns were the places where change stirred most vividly. To step into a medieval town was to feel a different rhythm altogether, one carried by markets and merchants, by craftsmen and guilds, by the hum of exchange and the steady rise of commerce. Here the air was filled with a kind of motion, a flow of voices and footsteps, and the scent of wares both common and rare. Towns were smaller than the sprawling cities we know today, yet they pulsed with energy. A market square might be the heart of such a place, its open space framed by timbered houses leaning toward each other, their upper floors jutting slightly over cobblestone streets. On market day, the square filled with colour and sound. Farmers arrived with baskets of vegetables, cheesemakers with wheels of pale and pungent cheese, brewers with barrels of ale. Merchants spread out bolts of cloth, pots of metal and trinkets carved from bone or wood. The air smelled of bread freshly baked, mingled with the less pleasant odours of animals' smoke and humanity packed close together. Yet behind the bustle of the market lay something quieter and more enduring: the guilds. These were the associations of craftsmen and tradesmen who not only worked together, but also governed their trades with rules and ritual. Each guild guarded its craft, whether weaving or blacksmithing, shoemaking or masonry, with great care. To be a member was both privilege and responsibility. The path into a guild was slow and deliberate. A boy might begin as an apprentice, bound to a master for years of training. He would sweep workshops, fetch tools, observe, and gradually learn the skills of the trade. When his training was complete, he could become a journeyman, traveling from town to town, seeking work, honing his abilities and proving his worth. Only when he created a piece of exceptional skill, a masterwork, could he be accepted as a master and granted the right to open his own shop, train apprentices, and take his place among the guild's leaders. Guilds did more than regulate craft. They cared for their members, supporting widows, aiding the sick, and ensuring funerals were observed with dignity. Their halls, often adorned with banners and symbols, became places not only of decision-making but also of fellowship. On feast days, members marched in processions, carrying candles or insignias of their trade, filling the streets with colour and music. Towns grew in wealth through trade, and as roads and rivers carried goods farther, markets swelled with items from distant places. Spices from the east, wool from England, wine from France, furs from the north, all these passed through the hands of merchants. Some grew prosperous enough to build fine houses, their windows glazed with glass, their walls decorated with painted plaster. Wealthier towns commissioned stone churches whose spires rose above rooftops, casting shadows that stretched across markets and houses alike. But life in towns was not only prosperity. Streets were narrow, often unpaved, and rain turned them to mud. Waste was tossed from windows and smells lingered in every corner. Fires broke out easily, spreading quickly through timber houses packed tightly together. Disease moved swiftly in such conditions, and towns often suffered harshly in times of plague. Yet for all this, towns drew people in. They promised opportunity, freedom from the feudal bonds of the countryside, and a chance for those of talent or luck to make new lives. The rhythms of town life were as regular as those of the fields, though different in tone. Bells marked hours, calling people to markets, to work, to prayer. Shoemakers hammered in their workshops, tailors bent over cloth, smiths struck iron, their sparks leaping into the dim light. Children darted through alleys, chasing each other past stalls and doorways. Women carried baskets of bread or water, exchanging greetings in the streets. In the evening, shutters closed, fires were stoked, and the town settled into a quieter hum, though taverns still glowed with laughter, song, and the sharing of ale. Guilds, meanwhile, kept their order. Apprentices practiced their skills under watchful eyes, journeymen debated prices and methods, masters gathered to set rules to decide who could sell what and to ensure no one cheated the standards of their craft. This careful regulation created a sense of fairness, a stability that made medieval towns more than chaotic gatherings of trade. They became communities bound by both necessity and pride. Religion shaped town life as it shaped village and castle alike. Churches stood at the heart of many towns, their bells marking hours, their interiors filled with flickering candles, their walls painted with saints and stories. On Sundays and feast days, markets grew quiet as townsfolk gathered within stone walls, kneeling together, their voices rising in chant. The guilds themselves often chose patron saints, offering candles and prayers in exchange for protection over their work and their lives. And within this world of trade and craft, a kind of identity emerged. A shoemaker was not simply a man who made shoes. He was part of a guild that carried traditions, rules, and honor. A weaver's cloth bore not just his skill, but also the reputation of his guild. A town, then, was more than its markets and streets. It was a tapestry of trades, each thread interwoven with others, bound together by both necessity and choice. Imagine walking into such a town as dusk settles. The stalls are closing, merchants packing their goods. The air is still warm from the day, though shadows lengthen in narrow alleys. A candle glows in a workshop window where a craftsman continues his work. From a tavern comes laughter and music, the clatter of cups. The church bell tolls softly, marking the hour, its sound drifting across rooftops and chimneys. And above it all, the town feels alive, not chaotic, not hurried, but steady, pulsing with the rhythm of lives, shaped by work, by ritual, and by the bonds of fellowship. The medieval town with its guilds and markets was both fragile and enduring. Fires might sweep through, plagues might strike, yet the rhythm of trade always returned, the sound of hammer and loom always began anew. These towns became seeds of change, places where freedom grew slowly, where wealth created new opportunities, and where, in the quiet of workshops and the noise of markets, the future of Europe was quietly, steadily being shaped.